Hello everybody, welcome to our next video from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So we are going to work on the mouse events and kind of the funky colors I teased in the last video to kind of get things kind of exciting and get your kids kind of really interested in this. We're also going to talk a little bit more about the kind of the mouse events and the if statements a fair bit. So I've added where I've typed myself this function mouse pressed. Now, one of the things you're going to want to do with your students is get them to start thinking very carefully about what I call good coding practices. And one of the things we're going to end up working with are something called a comment. So a comment is something in coding that you can write in English that gets ignored by the program. And there's lots of different ways to comment. The way we're going to do the simplest way is we're going to use what's called a slash slash. So what you'll see here is if I was to go above setup here and type something, whatever that is, and hit play, it's going to give me an error that something's gone, that it doesn't understand that. However, if you want to write something that you want the computer to ignore, you put a slash slash in front. And now what it does, it just completely ignores it. You'll notice down here there's no error. So why do you do that? Well, you do it for a lot of things. One of the things you might want to do is kind of help to explain parts of your code. So, for example, a little bit later on, we're going to start talking about different types of variables and then something called a global variable. So we might have up top a global variables area. We might have different things that kind of talk about our custom functions we're going to write a little bit later on. And one of the things I do very often with my students is I want to get them to start to help delineate their different functions from each other. So because we're going to have if statements inside these functions, we're going to have curly braces and indenting and curly braces and indenting. It's really easy for students to make a mistake on the curly braces. So one of the things I do that just helps get them in the habit of this early is I always ask them at the end of these functions to put slash slash end setup. And eventually I kind of get rid of the word end and just say slash slash setup, and they become familiar with that being the end of the setup function. Now this may seem a little bit redundant and not really important at the beginning, but trust me, once we start to get a whole bunch of if statements combined, this little simple little practice can save you a lot of troubleshooting issues later on. So that's the first thing. So once we get into my my if statements, you're going to see this go. So let's get the coding started. So if you remember, one of the things we did with mouse press is we did a console.log. So if you haven't seen the last video, we talked about using console.log to recognize a particular point. So you can draw a little bit. We're not going to need to worry about that for this. We're going to use mouse press for something different in a few minutes. So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to draw a line. And I'm going to start that line at the approximate center point of my screen, which is 300, 200. And that's because it's halfway and halfway. And then we need to know an end point. So if you remember, lines from last video start at one point and end at another point. So we're going to use the mouse X and the mouse Y. So those are the two built-in variables for mouse X and mouse Y. So now if I run this, you can see it's going to follow my mouse around the screen. As long as I'm inside my little console window or my canvas window, it will follow our mouse. Okay. Now I want to make that line a little bit bigger, so I'm going to go stroke weight, make it maybe about a 4. See what that looks like. If that does the visual I want, it's probably actually a little bit smaller, bigger than I want, but we'll leave it like that for the time being. Then what we want to do is talk about its color. So if you remember that lines don't have a fill. I don't know if I mentioned that last time. They only have a stroke. So of course we can put a stroke color, and we can put whatever we want. I'll put full blue just for that sake. Okay. Now one thing I want to show you now is something that I wouldn't do with your students till the very end. And that is that the use of background. You might want to do things a little bit differently with your background in order to make your animations animated. So what I want to do is I'm going to use my comment, my slash slash, in front of the word background to show you a little feature. Now I actually don't usually do this in front of students till later on. The reason that is it's kind of a nice kind of a surprise at the end to see what this does, but it's kind of nice for you as a teacher to know about this right away. So because I'm gonna comment, that we call it commenting out that background line in draw, I still want it to have a red background, so I'm still going to go put it into setup so it's there all the time to start with. But then I'm going to comment this line out, and what it does when I run it is it now does that. Right, so that's kind of a really interesting visual. So I usually don't do this early with students, I wait till I've got the whole entire program ready to go because it's a little more of a shock value if you leave it on. But this is kind of cool. So the idea of putting a comment in front of a line of code is quite common. It allows you to troubleshoot and to experiment and do different things. So you can say, well, what happens if I don't make that stroke weight 4? I leave it back at 1. Does that look a little better? And then you go, no, you know what? I like it in there. You can play around with things a little bit differently. But what makes this particular thing pretty exciting is to start to add random. And so here's a new feature. So right now we've made this blue, but if we make this random, this gives you a lot cooler of a visual. So I'm going to use the random code, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the 3 stroke numbers, where currently 00255, to be random. So the way it would look if I was doing it independently is this. Random and then a number, and so you want your max number. So I want random up to 255. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that random 255 and I'm going to place it in place of each of those 3 numbers. So you'll have to be very careful when you do this. If you're copying and pasting, it's best to maybe just type it, because you have to have random. It has its own brackets, 255, comma, random 255, comma, random 255, and make sure you're having 2 closed brackets. And now you get this really, really cool visual, and I think it actually looks even a little bit cooler if it's smaller than 4, maybe like about a 2. And you can have kids do really, really cool things with their mouse, and it's a really kind of interesting kind of wow factor if you left it on. In fact, I probably should have left it off. So if the difference, of course, is if you uncomment background, it does this. So what you need to talk to your students about is get them to think about what's happening. What was the difference? Why, when I have a background, is this just seem to be drawing once, but why, when I don't have a background, is it drawing multiple times? And the answer is actually not necessarily what you think. It's always drawing multiple times. So even in this case, it's drawing multiple times. But the problem, remember, the issue is that the draw function loops. So what it always does is it always goes back to background. So it draws one line, goes back to background, randomizes a stroke, draws a new line, goes back to background. So what happens is if I sit here, it still keeps randomizing the stroke color. It keeps redrawing the line, redrawing the background, redrawing the line, redrawing the background. If you take this line off, it no longer redraws that background, right? It's still drawing the once up and set up to give it the red color, but then it doesn't draw it again. So it's kind of a really, really cool, interesting visuul. Now, that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is what does it do if you do like text? So let me just save this. I'm going to pause and open up my text version for a minute just to show you one thing really quick with that. All right, so this is my the first example from our very first video, and if I run it, you'll notice it's got the text going across the screen. And I usually will actually do this with my students in the first one, but I kind of forgot about it. So if I was to comment out this background line, a couple interesting things will happen. First of all, what happens is the yellow goes away, but look what it does to the text. So what it does is it still keeps redrawing that text over and over and over again, but it's not refreshing the screen, so therefore it keeps wiping over top of it. Now you also notice the yellow went away. Why did the yellow go away? Because now the background was never being drawn. So I would want to put that back under setup if I want the yellow to be drawn, or do it in a different way. So that's something to be aware of as well, that it affects any kind of animated thing. If you want an animated visual, you definitely need to have a background line on. All right, let me go back to the other program. Okay, so we're back here. So first thing I want to do is I want to add one more functionality to our program with the mouse pressed. So last time I did a console.log to print out some helpful advice to user programmers. So we printed out mouse X and mouse Y so that we could actually help draw better. This time we're going to use mouse pressed with a little bit more of an actual like user-friendly function. And that is, I'm just going to simply say background. I'm going to call that background line in mouse pressed. So why would I want to do that? Well, why I want to do that is that's essentially your reset the screen. So if I click anywhere over here, click, 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 click. So now we've used our mouse press function in a way that's a little bit more interesting. Now, I said in this video I also want to talk about if statements. So we did one if statement last time, and again, what I'm going to do throughout these first few programs is just show you a few different uses of if statements. This one I'm going to show you about 3 or 4 extra little ones to kind of make this program a little more interesting. And you can decide if you want to kind of leave it at this. Quite often what I'll do is I'll do that previous example, the shapes example, and then I'll add this line, this rainbow line right to it. And then that's sort of the end of my lesson. So I kind of leave it at this as a kind of a little fancy kind of thing to get their creative juices going, and then I give them some play time and I leave it. But often what I'll do is I'll also start to add if statements and extra variables in here. So let's go do that. So I'm going to stop this just so we don't have the distraction of the flashy in a second. So what I'm going to do up here is, you notice I got this comment called global variables. So what's a global variable? A global variable is a variable that we're going to access anywhere in this program. There's something called a local variable, and I'll talk about the difference a little bit later on. Basically, the key difference is global variables can be used anywhere in the program. Local variables can only exist in a local areas as to where they're created. Okay. So I'm going to create a variable, and I'm just going to use this for the beginning of my line. So I'm going to call this line x. And I'm going to set it equal to somewhere maybe near the left side of the screen. So maybe I'll put it at 30. It doesn't really matter. And I may want to eventually do a line y as well, but if I add that in, I'll do that in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the location of the drawing from 300 to line x. Okay, so just to make sure that's working properly. Whoops. What did I do wrong? Uncaught. Line x is not defined. Oh, because I did not fulfill my camel case of a capital X. So again, make sure you're consistent. So there you go. So no big surprise what that's doing there. Okay. So now what we're going to do is something we did very similar to the scrolling text on the first day, but it will add something, an interesting element to this. And we're also going to talk about a couple other complicated things to go along with it. So, we're going to add the ability for the line x to move to the right. So I showed you this the other day, where I could say line x equals line x plus 1 or plus 2 or plus 3. What this does, it says take whatever's in line x, add 1 to it, and save it back in the line x. So the result of that is this. So now I've got a moving line, which can look kind of cool. If I just leave my mouse in one spot, of course, the x coordinate goes across, and then it keeps on going. So you'll notice, though, it keeps on going. So like we did previously, we want to add an if statement that wraps the screen. But we want to do a couple other extra things as well. Because this is a good time to talk about it, there are other ways you can add to a variable. It's kind of shortcuts. The shortcut for doing the exact same thing is to say line x plus equals 1. So if you say plus equals or times equals or multiply equals, then what that means is take whatever was in line x and add 1 to it and save it back in the variable. If it was times x, takes whatever is in line x, times it by whatever this is, save it back in the variable. Excuse me, that's a shortcut. The third shortcut that is really common is, because adding 1 is an extremely common thing to need to do in computing science, there is an even shorter shortcut called where you just say plus plus. So line x plus plus means add 1, line x minus minus means subtract 1. It's so common they made a special shortcut for it. Now there's no plus 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 that adds 2, that doesn't exist. So those two things, if you see in code very early, it's good to know. I'll leave the original one in, because that way we can also change that to be whatever number we want. Oh, look how short my line is going now. It's almost straight sideways. Okay, let me stop that. So let's do an if statement that says if, open our brackets, open our curly braces. If I don't start typing, it messes up my indenting, so that's why. And so we're going to say if line x is greater than, what's my width of my screen, 400, then we will set line x equal to 0. Okay, so now if line x gets too big, it will go back to 0. Now that's one thing we could do. What we might also want to do is do things a little bit different. Oh, it's not 400, it's 600, isn't it? Line x is greater than 600. So, all right. Now, what if we wanted this to, rather than scroll across the screen, let me just make sure you can see what it's doing, is it's going to scroll across the screen. Now, I actually like this visual more if the Y is a little bit higher up. It kind of just looks a little bit fancier, so I might change that a little bit. So, oops, I still have it at 400. Did I not hit play again? I think I'm going to move this up to the top of the screen just to give it a little bit more of a nicer visual up the top. I like it to be kind of right off the hop. There you go. Now it goes across and kind of makes a nice, interesting wipe across the screen. First of all, let's make sure it goes. So what I'd like to do next is something that I would not show students right away, but I think it's worth showing for you. And that is I want to perhaps make this go in both directions. Now, this is actually a concept that I wouldn't do right away, but I think it's worth showing you at this point in time before we jump into things. So you're going to need to know this right away. And that is what we're going to do is we're going to do a situation where in one case we're going to add 1 to line x, in the other case we're going to subtract 1 from line x. So we need an if statement to take care of that. And if you want to do two things, it's called an if-else statement. But the other thing we need to know is we need to know when does it go to the left and when does it go to the right. So we need to create a new variable up at the top. And I'm going to call this go right. I'm going to exaggerate the name to it. Go right. And I'm going to set this equal to true. Now, this is a particular type of variable in some languages. So if we were working with processing, I'd actually have to declare this a different type of variable because the number 30 is an integer and a variable that holds true or false is called a Boolean variable. Well, again, we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail later on, so don't worry if that's confusing. A Boolean variable is the term, Boolean is the term for true false that if statements use. So anytime you say line x is greater than 600, what it's actually, it's something called a Boolean expression, B-O-O-L-E-A-N, Boolean expression. And what you want to do is write something that's true. A variable can act as a Boolean expression on its own right. So what we're going to say is in one case, if go right is true, we're going to plus 1 to line x. If go right is not true, so if it's false, we're going to do the opposite. So here's how that works. We're going to surround this line x with an if statement. So we're going to say if go right. Now, go right itself is a true statement, so we can just do this. Okay. If it's true, we're going to go to the right, but then we're going to do an else statement. So if you've never coded before, this is something new. So now we have an if and an else statement. Notice the way that this is kind of structured. So curly brace, close curly brace for the if statement. Again, this could be 1 line or 5,000 lines of code in between these. And then you have an else with its own set of curly braces. So these two lines of code are tied together. These two chunks of code are tied together. So if this is true, it's going to do whatever is here and ignore this. If this is false, it's going to ignore this, jump to the else, and do whatever's there. So what we want to say is, well, if it's if go right is false, we want to say -1. Okay. Now, right now, go right is true. Okay, let's run it and make sure. So this shouldn't actually change our code. Yep, it's still working the way I want. But let's just make sure this works. If I was to set this to be false, or really you could set anything other than true, then you can see it's going off the other side. Right? It jumped immediately and started going to the left. It's hard to see because it's off the screen already. Okay, so now we need to say, okay, how do we get it to go from right to left? Well, now down here, we actually don't want line x to jump if it's greater than 600. We simply want to say if line x is greater than 600, we want to now set go right to false. If line x is less than 0, set go right back to be true. Normally what I do with students actually is I probably wouldn't do that right away. I would kind of leave the go right equals true in a little bit and get them to kind of figure out why it's not bouncing. But let's I'll just make this a little bit faster so we can get to show the demo for you guys a little bit quicker. But it should now, there we go, no matter what it is, now it's going across the screen and it'll bounce back if you wanted. Of course, I could also add something to the y variable if I wanted. Of course, I could play around with the visual a little bit like this. This is a little bit like how some of that SandArt program is written too. It does a little bit of this kind of situation with the mouse. In fact, it's kind of a neat little thing you could actually work on much later on in your course. And so this gives students the ideas right away. Now, so the next step you do with them is you say, okay, wait a minute. Okay, think about yesterday how we did this shape. Remember I started to draw a little dog or something like that. Well, so let's see if you can draw a dog, but create a variable for the dog's X location. See if you can get it to move across the screen. See if you can get it to animate. See what you can do. And so right away, kids will get really excited about this. And the first assignment we have them do kind of is not long after these little demos I've given to you, where I have them just draw a scene. It doesn't have to be animated. It doesn't have to move. It can be something simple like a snowman or a house on a street or a Stanley Cup or whatever. But then those that are kind of interested, I say, okay, now I've shown you some of this movement. Get the scene set up and working. But once you think it's working, let's see if you can add some movement to it. And then it's kind of a really great way to inspire students early. And of course, don't forget, we've also got our mouse click to go. So what do we do in this video? Well, we talked about different ways to use mouse press. Not really nothing special there, but just keep that in mind. There is also a key pressed function that works largely the same way, except of course later on you can eventually determine which key. And by the way, there is a way you can determine which mouse button as well that you pressed. Second thing we did is we added the idea of random. Random really isn't anything really special other than it could add some really cool visuals to your code. Kids like to play with it for sure very early. And don't forget, the other thing you can get them to experiment with is randomize other things. Randomize the stroke weight, randomize the background color, randomize the Y location of the mouse, right? Of the line. Tell them to do that. Tell them to take a few minutes to experiment and play around with it and see what it does, and then show off to everybody. Did anybody create something that looks really, really cool? Go for it. Just give them 10 minutes to play and see what they can do. And then the third thing, of course, we talked about is if statements. A little bit more into if statements. And again, this is a crash course, so you're not going to be 100% confident with this. But you have your basic if statement where you have what's called a Boolean expression. Tell if something is true or false. And if it is, do that. Then we added a kind of a two-part if statement. It was called an if-else. So add one thing, have one thing do something otherwise or else do something else. And along with that, we added the idea of using a variable to store true or false by itself. So quite a lot of stuff in here. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. Again, the idea is to give you sort of this crash course so that you can take the time later on and explore things in a little bit more detail. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks, everybody.